Cypress 10 was just released with one of the most anticipated features that I've been looking forward to, which is component testing. In today's tutorial, we're going to learn how to set up component testing, write some component tests, their benefits, and even learn how to do some spying. My name is Nikolai Advolatkin, and this is Ultimate QA, where developers come to learn how to test and testers learn how to develop. So let's go and learn Cypress component testing. All right, friends, so let's go ahead and get started with Cypress component testing. We're going to be following along with the documentation here on this URL. As you can see, we'll be doing Cypress component testing here for React. So if you want a text version, you got that here. However, of course, you're going to have a video version from me as well. And then the code is going to be available at this URL up here. So you can get that there. And of course, while you're here, go ahead and give this repo a star. I'll be super grateful. All right, let's go ahead and get started here. The very first thing that we want to do is install and create a React app. You can see we're calling it Cy-10, and we're going to be using Vite as the bundler. And so I'm going to hit that here, and then it's going to install. So now we can navigate to our new directory that we created, install it, and run the application. Then npm run dev to start the app. We can click the URL here, and there is our first application that's built. Wonderful. We can actually kill this server using Control-C because we don't need the application running to do component testing, which is one of the awesome advantages of component testing. And then next, we're going to want to install Cypress as a dev dependency. Let's take a look at our package JSON. So there is Cypress installed now. And then next, we just want to open it. Beautiful. So here is the new Cypress 10 UI. You can see there are two panes here, one for end-to-end testing, one for component testing. We're going to be focusing on component testing, so we are going to configure that next. If you're enjoying this tutorial and want to support this channel, be sure to hit the thumbs up button for the video. And if you want to be notified of every time a new tutorial is released, hit the subscribe button. Alrighty, so to configure component testing, we're just going to click in here. You can see that the project setup has automatically detected that we're using ReactJS and Vite. If you're using another framework for your application, you can see the types of applications that are supported. And also you can see the bundlers that are supported as well. So we're going to click next step. Everything here checks out. And then here are the new files that were added to our project. We got a Cypress config. We got a component.js file for component testing that adds a mount command. And then we got a commands.js file. And then we got a component index.html and an example.json. Cool. And now we can select one of our browsers that we want to test on. We're going to test on Chrome. Here is Chrome and what it looks like. You can see on the left-hand side, we got all the specs. Here, we're going to have the runs that can be uploaded to the Cypress dashboard. And then here we have an option to create a new spec file because this is our first time. So let's go ahead and do that. And we are going to name our spec file stepper.cy.jsx. So this is where we're going to have our test, and our component is going to be a JSX component. So it's important to have our file and then the same extension as well. And then let's run the spec. So there is the spec running. There is nothing really happening here, except it just shows that it passes. And then if we come to our IDE and come to Cypress component and look at stepper.sci, you can see what our stepper.sci.jsx looks like. Next, let's go ahead and actually create a component that we can test with Cypress. Before we dive into creating a component, one thing I do want to point out is Cypress does a really good job of explaining when component testing is good and is not good. And so here we can see creating a component and how there are easier to test components, such as like presentational components, layout components, and so on. And there are harder to test components. Example of components that are easier to test, you can see, are like buttons. And so just keep that in mind, that as we go through this tutorial, not everything is going to be as easy to test as I make it out to be. But of course, you have to start at the easy place and then build up. And so this is the component that we are going to be creating. It's a stepper. Let's add it to our repository here. I'm going to create a new file and then paste that in here. Let's take a look at this component. It's relatively simple. It's called a stepper. You can see it takes in an initial value with a default of 0, and then there is a use state method here that basically sets the counter on our count variable. And so on an on click, on this decrement on click, we will decrease the counter, and on the increment on click, we will increase the counter. So relatively simple component. So from a testing perspective, how would we actually test this using a component test? Let's go to our file, and the very first thing that we need to do is, of course, import our stepper component. And then we have our test, and then we have to mount our component first. The mount component basically allows us to interact with the component. It's a little bit different than in Cypress. You used to use the cypress.url command in order to navigate to a certain location in an end-to-end test. With component tests, we don't actually need to navigate to any URL. In fact, we don't even need a server running in order to be able to test the components, because we are working directly with the JavaScript and the styling instead of working through the black box of the browser and interacting through the browser. So let me show you what I mean. So if we save this here and then we come back to our Cypress UI, you can see that now we have this stepper test, and we ensure that it mounts, and you can see that there's a step that basically says it mounts, and you can see our component here. Of course, the component doesn't have any styling. It's a very simple component, but this is what it actually looks like. And we can interact with it and test it just if we would. And of course, we don't have a server in our application running. I can show you that if we navigate to localhost 3000, you can see that there is nothing. If we did have an application running, it'd be here in my terminal, but you can see there's no server running except the Cypress server. All right, so now that we have our component mounted, a question for you. Where would you start to test this component, right? This is what the code looks like. You can see it underneath. Where would you start to test it? Think about it. Pause the video. When you come back, we'll talk about it. Welcome back. So where I like to start testing, and I think it's the most logical place to start testing, is the most basic kind of cases. You start with basic and then you try to build up, right? You start with basic tests, you add a little bit more complicated tests. You're not going to be able to get all of the testing in place. Sometimes you will miss edge cases, you'll get a bug, and then you add those new tests to cover that bug and prevent it in the future. So it's just a game of figuring that out. And so the most basic kind of tests are first, that the stepper starts with an initial state of 0, right? I mean, it could easily be, this could be a requirement, and then at some point it could be messed up. So we want to make sure that it starts with an initial state of 0. And then we also want to make sure that if we pass in some value in here, that it actually changes. So in order to do that, we're going to replace this code with this code right here. And a few items to notice about this code. So at the very top, you'll see the selectors, right? You'll notice there are stepper selectors and increment and decrement selectors. And the stepper selector has a data test ID attribute. And this attribute is a unique attribute, very useful for testing. Look where we're adding it here in the stepper right there. It's very useful to have this test ID attribute because now we can refer to this element and have this be unique. And as we change our application, change up this markup, as long as we keep this attribute the same, our tests don't have to change because of the locator. It's the best locator value to use for this kind of testing. And then next, we have two types of tests, right? That a stepper should default to 0. So just mounting the component, getting our stepper selector, and asserting that the text should be 0. And then we have a second test where we also mount the component, but with an initial value of 100. And then we check that the stepper selector contains the corresponding value. So if I save this and we come back here, you will see that our component test executed, right? We have our component test here, and here is the first component test. We're mounting the stepper, and then we're getting that locator, and then we're asserting that it contains 0, which it does. And then the second test is the same thing, but we injected 100 here, and then we're asserting that the text contains 100, right? So if we wanted to break one of these tests, for example, and say something like 1, run it, we run this test, you can see what happens when we run this test and it fails. It takes a little bit of time. And then here it says that we expected the text to contain 1, but actually it was 0. So obviously that was the result of us expecting the 1. And then the other thing that I wanted for you to quickly note is look how fast these component tests execute, because they don't require a browser, they don't require any kind of network conditions. They execute on the exact, like source code. They run extremely fast. And that's one of the reasons why I personally love doing component tests, especially for front-end web applications like this. Okay, so let's continue our testing journey. Looking at the component here, what else should we test? What else is a risk here that can be broken in our component? Think about it for a moment, pause the video, write down your answer. When you come back, we'll talk about it. All right, welcome back. So what I see as risks here is this on-click method, right? Probably one of the most important functionalities of this stepper component are the on-click handlers, right? Number one, first, do they actually exist? And then number two is, do they perform the correct operation, right? It's very easy, for example, to create a button and forget to add an on-click handler. Or it's also very easy to have an on-click handler, but have it do the completely wrong thing. And so it's important to test that functionality so that it's not a risk in our application. So how we are going to test this is we're going to add 2 more tests. Let's come down here. This is what our tests look like. So the first one, it says it can be incremented, of course, mounting the component. And now we're simply using the increment selector, which is this one up here. And then we're clicking it. And then, of course, we're checking that the text there is 1 because we started at 0. clicked one time, should be 1. And then we're doing the same exact thing for the decrement selector and asserting that the text there is -1. Let's go take a look at our tests and see what happened. So here are our tests. So we have the first one that starts at 0, another one that's at 100, and then here is the increment, right? So you can see here as we get this element, you can see on the right-hand side how it highlights it, and here's us clicking it. And you can see the before and after state if I leave it here hovering. And of course, getting the ID afterwards, the text does contain 1, and then the decrement, same thing, we can get the element, and then as we click on it, you can see the before and after states of the click, and then we get the locator and check that it's -1. So our application is working exactly as expected. We could have tested it through the browser, but that's unnecessary with a component test because it runs so fast and we exercise the same exact functionality as we would have through the browser, just in a more efficient manner. There is also one other test that we could write, is to play with this component as a real user would, and maybe, start at a certain state, increment it, and then decrement it, and then assert that that works accordingly. It's very similar to these individual tests. However, we can also just encompass all of that into a single test, and that won't be a problem either. So if we wanted to do that more, again, integration style test, it's still doing a component test, but just, more flow test, doing a scenario where we're doing a bunch of stuff. So that's what this test would look like. So let's go ahead and save it, starting at 100, making sure that the initial state is correct, incrementing to 101. That, of course, makes sure that the state is correct. And then here we're getting the decrement selector, clicking it 2 times, and then that should go down to 99. Let's take a look at our test. So here is what that test looks like, right? So we start at 100, getting the element, clicking it, right? So increasing it to 100, and then clicking it once down to 100, clicking it a second time down to 99, and then of course the value comes back as 99. So you have that option there. It's like, which test do you want to write? You can write a little bit larger test, write less code, because you don't have to have the repetitive nature of this kind of work. However, a larger test can sometimes be a little bit more difficult to diagnose in terms of what is the root cause of the issue. And so smaller tests are easier to diagnose, but can take a little bit more work and a little bit more code, as you might have more of them. All right, and then in the last part of the video, we're going to talk about how to listen for events from our components. If you're enjoying this tutorial and want to support this channel, be sure to hit the thumbs up button for the video. And if you want to be notified of every time a new tutorial is released, hit the subscribe button. Currently, our stepper component looks as you see the code here, which is okay for our purposes. However, you can imagine that it might be a bit more difficult for a parent component that uses the stepper to figure out what the on-click events are doing. And so in those kinds of situations, it's actually easier to just pass in a on-change prop and then be able to track what that on-change prop does and doesn't do inside of our test. So it would actually be something like this. This would be our component where we have the stepper, and then we're passing in an on-change prop, and then we can be tracking the actions of this method right here. And so we can actually refactor our component to look like this. Let's grab this and drop it in our code. We can see here that what we've changed is we have now a method here called increment and a method called decrement. And then we also have an onChange method that updates the new count. And so actually, if we save this, our tests from Cypress should still continue to work. We can rerun them here together, and they do, right? So that is one of the wonderful things of automated testing is whenever we make such major refactorings, our tests continue to work because the functionality hasn't changed. We simply refactored the code to make it more testable. And so now, if you wanted to test this to make sure it works accordingly, we can use the concept of spies. Let me show you. I'm going to come down here and paste this test that looks like this. You'll notice a totally new implementation here where we are creating a spy and giving it an alias called onChange spy. We are mounting our component and passing in that onChange spy. So whatever action is performed on the spy, we're going to be able to know about it and then assert on those actions, right? And so if we get the incrementer and click it, then we check that our onChange spy should have been called with 1. And the reason for that is if we navigate to our stepper component, and we passed in our onChange spy, right, and we're clicking the increment button, it should have been called with 1. And so now if we come back here, we can see what that test looks like. There's a spy stop created here. We're mounting the component, getting the button, clicking it, and then you can see clicking it before and after. And then there's a spy that checks that onChange spy should have been called at least once, right? If we, for example, change it to 2, that's going to be incorrect. Okay, so I did have to make one change to my assertion here in that I changed this part here that's saying that our onChange spy should have been called once with 1 argument. That actually works better than my previous assertion, which was not working. So here, take a look. If we run it, this is what it looks like. Expected onChange spy to have been called exactly once with 1 argument. Correct? Yeah, that's good, right? And then if we change it, for example, to 2, that's going to fail because it's going to expect 2 arguments. And then if for whatever reason onChange spy also was called more than once, I'm trying to think if I could fake it. So if for whatever reason this even was correct, but we had another bug in our stepper where you saw I called onChange 2 times instead of 1 time, then that will also fail, and then we get an assertion that's saying expected onChange spy to have been called exactly once with 1 argument. But then you can see that there were 2 calls made, one here onChange spy and then another onChange spy. So it was made 2 times, hence we introduced the bug. So if we get rid of it, save that, the tests automatically rerun and everything passes. This is successful. Thanks so much for tuning in into today's tutorial. I've been Nikolai Volodkin, and now I got a question for you. What do you want to learn next? Definitely go ahead and comment down below. I read every single comment and I will create a list and I'll turn that list of requests into tutorials. And as always, if you want to keep up with me, you can follow me on Twitter for amazing dev quotes, and you can also follow me LinkedIn for professional connections. And if you want to learn how to test better in a weekly newsletter format, you can grab the link to that down below. Thanks so much and have an amazing day.